A poor girl found a wallet full of cash in the park and returned it to the owner. The next day, the millionaire invited her and her struggling mother to his mansion, where they uncovered that. The sun was setting over the neighborhood, casting a golden glow across the streets. But to Brenda, it just meant another long day of work was finally over. She walked slowly, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. She wore her faded grey uniform, the sleeves pushed up to reveal hands worn and calloused from scrubbing and cleaning other people's houses day in and day out. She couldn't recall the last time she'd had an evening off, a night without worrying about having enough food for her daughter. Laurie was doing okay. Brenda didn't have time for dreams or indulgences. Since Fred, her husband, had walked out without a word, life had been an endless struggle. But every evening when she returned home, there was one thing that kept her going. One thing that made getting up each morning just a little easier: Laurie's smile. Laurie was 9 but wise beyond her years. She was small, with a head of tangled dark hair that seemed to be constantly in disarray after hours of playing in the nearby park. To Laurie, that park was a world of her own, a place where she could escape and pretend life was simpler, filled with make-believe adventures. She always played by herself, dreaming up stories of heroes and imaginary quests, but she was careful to come home before it got dark, just in time to greet her mom. Brenda's tired expression softened as she thought of Laurie's bright, joyful face that morning as they'd said goodbye. There was something in Laurie's eyes that reminded Brenda of her younger self, a version of her that was still full of hopes and dreams. But those dreams had slipped away, replaced with the stark reality of bills she couldn't pay, clothes Laurie needed, and an almost empty pantry. Reaching her modest apartment, Brenda finally turned the key and stepped inside. The place was simple: faded walls, worn-out furniture. But it was home. She noticed that Laurie hadn't come back from the park yet. She's probably lost track of time, Brenda thought, as she set her bag down on the couch. Even though her whole body ached to rest, she headed to the kitchen and started preparing a simple dinner instead. Even though the pantry was nearly bare, she managed to pull together a meal from the few ingredients left. She heard the front door creak just as she was about to set the table, and then Laurie sprinted in with an unusual amount of excitement on her face. "Mom, look what I found!" Laurie blurted out, panting as she pulled something out of her backpack. Brenda turned, surprised to see her daughter holding a large brown leather wallet, sturdy and clearly expensive. A chill ran through Brenda as she watched Laurie eagerly open it, revealing its contents. It was full of cash. Not just a little, but more than Brenda had ever seen in one place before. Her mind began to whirl. That money could solve so many problems. She could pay the bills, fill up the pantry, and maybe even get Laurie the new school clothes she desperately needed. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. "I found it in the park, Mum," Laurie explained, her voice a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "It was just lying there on the ground, right by the bench where I always sit." Brenda moved closer, still shocked. She took the wallet and looked through it. Alongside the cash was an ID card bearing the name Charles. She didn't recognize the name, but something about the high-quality wallet and the money suggested that this person came from a different world than theirs. Silence hung in the small room as they both stared at the wallet. Brenda took a deep breath. She knew what needed to be done, though the weight of her struggles, the unpaid bills, and endless nights of worry felt heavy on her chest. What if... "Mom, what are we going to do?" Laurie asked, her innocent face showing an unexpected blend of maturity. Brenda looked into her daughter's eyes, and for a moment, all her exhaustion seemed to lift. They couldn't keep the money. Something more important was at stake. Since Fred had left, Brenda had tried to teach Laurie the values he never upheld: honesty, integrity, hard work. if they kept the money? What kind of example would she be setting? "We're going to return it, Laurie," Brenda said firmly, though the words felt like a painful sacrifice. Laurie nodded, silently understanding. She had expected this answer from her mom, but the reality of it was still hard to swallow. Brenda gazed at her daughter and felt both pride and sadness well up. She knew they'd made the right choice, yet she also realized they were once again choosing the harder path. Brenda tucked the wallet away in a drawer, determined to find its owner the next day. That night, as she tucked Laurie into bed, she couldn't help but wonder about the story behind the man who owned that wallet. And how would he react when he finally saw them? But those lingering questions couldn't shake the certainty in Brenda's heart. That day, her daughter Laurie, a kind and caring soul, had grasped a lesson that was bound to shape her life. It was one Brenda hoped would remain with her always. Switching off the light in Laurie's room, Brenda bent down and kissed her forehead, softly whispering, "I'm so proud of you, my love." In the darkness, Laurie's gentle smile glowed. And while the future held its mysteries, both mother and daughter found comfort that night, knowing they had chosen the path of integrity. The early morning sun barely crept through the thin, worn curtains in the modest room they shared, gently waking Brenda. Laurie was still asleep, peacefully bundled in her blanket, as Brenda braced herself for the difficult decision they had made. The responsibility of returning the wallet had weighed on her all night. Though she knew it was right, a small part of her couldn't help but think about what they were giving up. She quietly opened the drawer, retrieved the wallet, and held it in her hands, feeling the same temptation she had resisted the night before. Inside, she found the cash, a good amount of it, and an ID for a man named Charles. "There's so much we could do with this money," she thought briefly, before firmly shaking her head. She knew such thoughts were dangerous, and returning the wallet was the right choice, a lesson Laurie needed to understand. But beyond that, Brenda was determined to teach her daughter that, despite life's hardships, their values had to come first. By the time Laurie awoke, Brenda had prepared a simple breakfast of toast and tea. They ate in silence, but Laurie could sense her mother's unease. The tension from the night before lingered in the air, and she could tell her mother was carrying a heavy burden. "Are we going to return the wallet today?" Laurie asked, breaking the quiet. Brenda nodded, striving to appear calm. "Yes, we are. That money doesn't belong to us, and whoever lost it must be worried sick," she replied, her voice steady, masking the inner conflict she felt. Laurie gave a reluctant nod, her stomach churning at the thought of giving back such a large amount of money. She was just a kid, and while she knew honesty mattered, she was also aware of how much her mom struggled. The idea that this money could lighten her mom's burdens tempted her, but her mind kept circling back to Brenda's teachings about doing the right thing. After they had breakfast, Brenda and Laurie started getting ready to head out. Brenda, despite her nerves, tried to appear calm and assured. She checked the address from the wallet's ID, and as soon as she saw the street name, she realized it was far from any area they knew well. It was one of those upscale neighborhoods, a part of town that felt unreachable to people like them. The mansion was perched on a hill, surrounded by other grand homes that seemed to exist in a different reality. "Mum, do you think they'll even let us in at such a big place?" Laurie asked, glancing up at her mom with a hint of worry as they left home. Brenda gave her a small smile, though she shared Laurie's apprehension. "I don't know, honey. But it doesn't matter. We have to do what's right, no matter the size of the house. What counts is that we're returning something that isn't ours." The walk was a long one, and as they went, Brenda couldn't help but wonder about who they'd meet once they arrived. She imagined a wealthy man, maybe distant and cold, accustomed to treating people like them as strangers. The thought of standing in front of someone who had so much, while they struggled for the basics, only made her determination grow. Finally, they entered a part of town where the homes became more extravagant. The streets were broad, lined with trees and immaculate gardens. As they got closer, the houses just grew larger and more opulent. Laurie walked quietly, mesmerized by the impressive mansions, while Brenda's heart raced faster with every step. When they finally arrived at the address on the ID, they stopped in front of an enormous iron gate. Beyond it was a towering mansion with several stories nestled in a perfectly groomed garden. The scene looked like something straight out of a movie, like the pictures Brenda had only ever seen in magazines or on TV. She felt a tight knot in her stomach. Wow, it's massive. Laurie muttered admiration while clearly in awe of the grandeur. Brenda took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to her daughter with a mix of pride and nervousness. "It is," she said softly. "But remember, it's not about the size of the house or the wealth of the people who live here. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do." She seemed to be reassuring herself as much as her daughter. With a determined nod, Brenda pressed the intercom button beside the gate. Seconds ticked by, feeling like an eternity, before a woman's voice responded. "Who is it?" Brenda's heart skipped a beat, but she answered with steady resolve. "We're here to return a wallet that belongs to someone who lives here, Charles." Her voice was firm, though she could feel her pulse quicken. After a moment of silence on the other end, the gates began to open slowly. Brenda held Laurie's hand, and together they stepped onto the property. As they walked down the expansive driveway, perfectly lined with vibrant flowers, Brenda felt a sense of smallness against the overwhelming luxury around them, but her commitment to doing the right thing kept her focused. They reached the main entrance, where a well-dressed woman, likely a staff member, greeted them. She looked them over, with a mix of curiosity and a touch of condescension, as if unsure why they were there. "What can I help you with?" she asked, her tone slightly skeptical. Unfazed, Brenda held out the wallet. "My daughter found this at the park. It belongs to someone named Charles. We wanted to return it." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the response. After a pause that felt just a bit uncomfortable, she gestured for them to come inside and led them to a waiting room. The room felt like a museum, walls adorned with landscape paintings and portraits, and antique furniture that looked more like artifacts than everyday items. As they waited, Brenda couldn't shake the sense that, for all the luxury, the mansion felt strangely empty, as if time had stopped here. Laurie, wide-eyed and innocent, took it all in with wonder. She couldn't imagine living in a place like this, but there was a sadness in the air that made her uneasy. "Mum, why does everything feel so sad here?" she whispered. Brenda didn't have an answer. She just sensed that something was off, though she couldn't quite place it. Before she could think more on it, the door to the room opened and a man stepped in. His hair was slightly unkempt, his suit well-tailored but carrying a hint of neglect. His expression betrayed a deep weariness, a kind of emotional exhaustion he couldn't hide. It was Charles. His face was unreadable as he glanced at Brenda and Laurie, but a flicker of surprise showed when he noticed the wallet in Brenda's hands. "Is that my wallet?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Brenda nodded and offered it to him with a modest gesture. "My daughter found it in the park, and we thought you'd want it back." Charles took the wallet, his gaze shifting briefly to the little girl who had returned it. An uneasy silence settled between them as he took in the moment. It wasn't often that someone returned a wallet full of cash without expecting anything in return, especially someone who, by their appearance, might have needed it. "Thank you," Charles finally said, his tone steady, though a hint of sincerity, however reserved, did reach Brenda. Laurie met his eyes directly, and somehow her innocent expression seemed to reach a buried part of Charles's heart. The quiet stretched in the mansion's spacious living room, a room so grand and refined that Laurie felt almost swallowed by its vastness. The high ceilings and walls covered in paintings and portraits seemed imposing. Brenda, perched on the edge of one of the plush sofas, took in every detail with a blend of discomfort and wonder. The last time she had been in such a luxurious setting was years ago at a fleeting social event, back when she was still married to Fred, before everything had changed. That memory felt distant, like a scene from another lifetime. Charles moved carefully, as though carrying a heavy burden, his gaze flickering between Brenda and her daughter, who were still taking in their surroundings with fascination. At last, he settled into a chair fit for royalty, though his demeanor did not carry that sense of grandeur. Brenda searched for words to break the tension. The chilly, quiet atmosphere of the mansion made her feel out of place, and Charles's reserved gaze only intensified that feeling. "We're glad you got your wallet back," she said at last, easing the silence. Charles nodded slowly. "I didn't expect anyone to return it, especially someone who I suppose might have been tempted to keep it for themselves," he replied, observing them with both curiosity and a slight wariness. His comment wasn't meant to offend, but it landed with a slight sting, and Brenda felt a subtle discomfort. Brenda understood that money could change things, but she wasn't the type to take advantage of someone else's fortune. She knew Charles lived in a world where people often grabbed what wasn't theirs if given a chance. But that just wasn't her way. She wanted Laurie to grow up with different values. "We're not expecting any kind of reward if that's what you're getting at," Brenda said, her voice firm yet respectful. "My daughter just did the right thing." Laurie, who had been silent up to this point, nodded eagerly. "Mom always says we shouldn't keep what isn't ours," she added, flashing Charles a sincere smile. Charles' expression softened a bit. He'd been distant and reserved, but something about Laurie's innocence seemed to catch him off guard. For a brief moment he thought of his own daughter, the one he lost long ago, and felt a familiar ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "You're right, little one. Not many people would have done what you did," he said, in a gentler tone than Brenda had anticipated. As Laurie, beaming with pride, Brenda felt the tension in the room lessen and give way to a sense of relief. Then Charles spoke up, his tone returning to its usual formality. "I'd like to offer something to you as a thank you," he said. "I know you're not looking for anything, but it would make me feel better if you accepted." Brenda braced herself, not wanting him to think they had come for a reward, but also not wanting to offend by refusing outright. "Really, that's not necessary," she began. But Charles interrupted. "It's not just about money. I'd like to invite you both to stay for a while." He paused, as if weighing his words. "There's something, I don't know, something about you both that brings back memories I haven't visited in a long time." Brenda wasn't entirely sure how to respond to that. There was an intensity in his gaze, not uncomfortable, but as though he was searching for something he'd lost. Laurie was gazing down at her, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the artwork, books, and opulent decor all around them. "Please, stay a little longer," Charles urged, his voice carrying an unexpected hint of vulnerability. Brenda, taken aback by this shift in his tone, gave a slow nod. Despite the grand, but initially unwelcoming mansion, something in Charles's demeanor hinted at a depth beyond the polished facade. "All right, we'll stay for a while," Brenda replied, still somewhat wary. Charles, acknowledging her response, offered them drinks. As they waited, Laurie rose from the sofa and wandered toward one of the large windows overlooking the backyard. Her eyes widened with delight as she took in the sight of the vast, vibrant garden filled with rare flowers and sparkling fountains. "Mom, look at this! It's like a huge wonderland!" she exclaimed, her excitement palpable. From his chair, Charles observed Laurie's reaction, and for the first time since they'd arrived, a small smile appeared. "Would you like to go see it?" he asked, his invitation directed at the young girl. Laurie's grin was so radiant it seemed to light up the room as she eagerly nodded. "Yes, please." Charles stood and gestured for them to follow him out to the garden. Brenda walked behind, her guard still up, but feeling a sense of curiosity about this man that her initial impressions hadn't revealed. The garden was truly a sight to behold. Stone pathways wound gracefully through lush greenery, and fountains spilled softly, filling the space with a soothing sound. Laurie darted among the flowers, her laughter filling the air as she explored the garden's beauty. Brenda, watching her daughter, turned to Charles. "It's a beautiful place," she remarked, though she couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the garden's beauty, a somber atmosphere lingered over the mansion. Charles nodded, his gaze fixed on Laurie, with an expression Brenda found difficult to read. "My daughter used to play here," he murmured, almost to himself. Brenda stayed quiet, sensing she had brushed against a tender part of his past. She didn't know much about him, but she was beginning to realize that wealth and luxury hadn't filled the ache in his heart. "Laurie is a special child," Charles added after a moment, breaking the silence. "She reminds me so much of her." He didn't elaborate, but Brenda understood. There was a loss, a grief that he carried, but wouldn't fully reveal. Choosing not to press further, she decided to steer the conversation in a lighter direction, though she felt a strong sense of compassion for him. As Laurie continued her explorations in the garden, Charles's reserved demeanor began to soften, shifting the tone from formal to something warmer, almost familial. Brenda, while still reserved, began to notice Charles in a new light. He had all the wealth in the world, yet he seemed burdened by an inner emptiness that intrigued her. As the afternoon drifted into the evening, Charles led them back inside. Just as Brenda was about to thank him and take her leave, he spoke up unexpectedly. "I'd like for you to come back sometime soon. Laurie seems to enjoy this place, and I'd like to see you both again." Brenda hadn't anticipated such an offer. She hesitated for a moment, uncertain of how to respond. But Laurie, standing beside her, looked up at Charles with a wide grin and answered before Brenda could. "Sure, I'd love to come back." Charles's smile softened, and for a brief instant, Brenda sensed a glimpse of something in him, perhaps a hidden part longing for connection. A lonely man who might just need a bit of warmth to rekindle his spirit. "All right, we'll come back," Brenda replied, a trace of surprise in her voice. They said their goodbyes, and the housekeeper who had greeted them earlier escorted them out. As they crossed the iron gate and returned to their familiar world, Brenda couldn't shake the thought of how meeting Charles seemed to have touched a vulnerable part of him. Laurie, lively as always, chatted excitedly on the way home, while Brenda walked silently, lost in reflection. Life hadn't been easy for her and her daughter, but it felt like that genuine encounter had begun to weave their lives with that of a man seeking something more. And somehow, Brenda felt that this could change everything. The following day carried a new sense of anticipation that Brenda couldn't quite ignore. Charles's words, "I'd like for you to come back sometime soon," echoed in her thoughts. Brenda, who was used to the aloofness of the wealthy, could never have imagined a man like him, seemingly detached and wounded, would open his life to them. She awoke the next morning feeling conflicted, while Laurie could barely contain her excitement. Over breakfast, Laurie chatted non-stop, wondering when they'd visit the mansion again. For her, it had been a magical place brimming with adventure, and despite his quiet demeanor, she viewed Charles as a kind soul beneath the sadness in his eyes. "Mum, are we going back today?" Laurie asked, wide-eyed, as she munched on her toast. Brenda gave her a soft smile. She didn't want Laurie to get too attached to the idea, yet she couldn't deny the kindness Charles had shown. "I'm not so sure, Laurie. I don't want you thinking we can just visit any time we feel like it." "It's not our place," Brenda said gently, aiming to keep her daughter's expectations in check. But Laurie, with her ever-hopeful spirit, wasn't so easily discouraged. "But Charles likes us, doesn't he?" Laurie asked, a bright smile lighting up her face in their small kitchen. Brenda let out a sigh. Truthfully, she wasn't certain herself. The connection she had felt with Charles had caught her off guard. A man as broken as she was, though for different reasons. Somehow, it seemed like fate had thrown them together, though she wasn't sure what that meant yet. "Yes, he does seem to like us," Brenda finally replied. "But we need to respect his space. We can't just turn up at his doorstep." Even as she spoke, Brenda couldn't ignore a part of herself that wanted to return. There was something about Charles, a blend of mystery and melancholy, that stirred her curiosity. Still, she wasn't ready to admit it, not even to herself. Later that morning, as she tried to refocus on her daily tasks, the doorbell chimed, snapping her from her thoughts. When she answered, a uniformed deliveryman handed her a white envelope with Laurie written in elegant script on the front. "For me?" Laurie asked, her eyes sparkling as Brenda passed her the envelope. She opened it, revealing a formal invitation inside. Charles was inviting them back to his mansion that very afternoon to enjoy tea in the garden. Brenda, no stranger to life's unexpected turns, found herself smiling at Charles's gesture. "Can we go, Mum?" Laurie asked eagerly, her eyes wide with hope. Brenda paused to consider it. She didn't want Laurie to get too attached to a world that wasn't theirs. But on the other hand, turning down the invitation felt unnecessarily stiff, and she too was curious about what more time with Charles might reveal. "All right, we can go for a bit," Brenda finally said, smiling as Laurie leaped with excitement. That afternoon, mother and daughter found themselves once more on the path to the mansion. This time, the long walk to the front door didn't seem as daunting to Brenda, though the grandeur still reminded her just how far removed this life was from her own. The day before, Charles's kindness had subtly shown her that wealth didn't always equate to arrogance. The woman in charge of the household welcomed them once more when they arrived, but this time her eyes were a little warmer. She graciously guided them to the garden, where Charles was already waiting. The garden, as Laurie remembered, was vibrant and alive with color. One of the fountains had set up a table, and the flowers sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Charles was seated, taking in the scenery. As Brenda and Laurie approached, a small smile softened his expression. "Thank you for coming," Charles greeted them, standing up. "I'm glad you accepted the invitation." Brenda quickly noticed he seemed different today, more at ease, less reserved. She wondered if Laurie's presence and the connection they'd shared the day before were starting to make a difference. "Thanks for inviting us. Laurie's been looking forward to this all morning," Brenda said with a smile, glancing at her daughter, who was already darting toward the flowers. Charles nodded and took a seat again, motioning for Brenda to join him. "She's a special girl," he said, watching Laurie explore the garden with endless curiosity. "She reminds me of my daughter." Brenda looked over, sensing this might be one of the few times he spoke openly about his past. She wanted to respect his boundaries, but couldn't help her curiosity. "What was she like?" she asked softly. Charles paused, as though searching for the right words. The brief calmness on his face clouded again. "She was everything to me," he said, his voice carrying a weight of sorrow. "Smart, curious, just like Laurie. She had a spark that could light up any room." Brenda noticed the deep sadness in his eyes and chose not to push further. Despite his pain, Charles was opening up, and that was no small step. "She must have been an amazing child," Brenda replied gently. Charles nodded slowly, looking down briefly before meeting her gaze and changing the subject. "Laurie seems to love the garden. I'm glad she has a space here where she can run around and play," Charles said, a faint smile appearing as he watched Laurie skipping among the flowers. Brenda observed him thoughtfully. There was something about Charles that made her feel that beneath all the sorrow and distance lay a kind heart. A man who had been hurt, and who, for some reason, was beginning to heal in Laurie's presence. The afternoon slipped by gently. Although still reserved, Charles seemed more at ease and talkative than the previous day. He opened up with stories about his life before everything fell apart, sharing his love for travel and architecture, things that used to bring him joy before grief took over. Brenda too shared memories, mainly tales of her life with Laurie, steering clear of any mention of Fred and the challenges she'd faced since he'd left. As the sun started dipping lower, the tranquility in the garden felt almost tangible. A tired but joyful Laurie finally came back to her mother after hours of playing. "Can we come back another day, Mum?" Laurie asked, her eyes bright, glancing at both Brenda and Charles. Before Brenda could reply, Charles answered, "You're welcome here anytime. This place doesn't feel as empty with you both around." Brenda couldn't help but smile at his words. There was an authenticity in Charles's invitation, a sense that it was more than just politeness, almost as if he genuinely needed their presence, as much as they, in their own way, needed someone like him. "Thank you, Charles. We'll see if we can visit again soon," Brenda replied, warmly but cautiously. She was grateful for the invitation, but wary of letting it become something that they, or especially Laurie, might rely on emotionally. When it came time to leave, Charles once again walked them to the door. As Brenda said her goodbyes, she sensed a subtle shift in the bond they were forming. Charles hadn't only revealed a softer side, he'd also opened a door that had seemed long shut. On the drive home, the evening sky darkened, but Brenda felt something new awakening in their lives, something that held the potential to bring lasting change. The mansion, though elegant and filled with beauty, had a lingering atmosphere, a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow, that Brenda was starting to perceive more clearly with each visit. Despite its grandeur, there was an unmistakable sense of emotional weight hanging in the air. Their talks with Charles, while pleasant, always carried a touch of sadness. As Brenda and Laurie continued their visits, Brenda began noticing little details about Charles's life that stirred both curiosity and concern. Deborah, the housekeeper, appeared to be the one who could shed light on some of these mysteries. One afternoon, while Laurie was playing outside in the garden like she usually did, Brenda stayed behind in the kitchen to chat with Deborah. Deborah had always been attentive and kind, with an air that suggested she'd been in the mansion for ages. Brenda felt Deborah knew more than she often revealed, and over time, their friendship had grown close enough for deeper conversations. "This place, it feels so empty, despite how stunning it is," Brenda remarked as she assisted Deborah in preparing tea. Deborah looked at her, hesitating as if she were debating whether to share something long kept. Finally she sighed and set the teapot down. "It does. This house has witnessed a lot of joy, but also a great deal of sorrow," she said, with a somber tone. Picking up on Deborah's willingness to talk, Brenda gently nudged the conversation forward. "Charles told me a bit about his daughter and how deeply her loss has affected him." Deborah nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Claudia," she murmured softly, a hint of sadness in her voice. She was a beautiful soul, just like your Laurie, always running through this garden, always bringing laughter to the house. Brenda could imagine it, a young girl like Laurie, dancing along the flower-lined paths, her joy filling the air. But there seemed to be more to the story, something Deborah seemed reluctant to bring up, as though speaking it aloud might bring painful memories to life. What happened to her? Brenda asked, sensing the delicacy of her question, but needing to know the truth. Deborah fell silent for a moment. Her hand shook slightly as she gripped the teapot. An accident. It was a day that changed everything, she said quietly. Mr. Charles was never quite the same after that. He lost more than his little girl that day. He lost his spirit, his joy. Deborah's gaze dropped as she continued. Since then, this place has felt cold, empty. Miss Claudia was the light of his life, and when she was gone, so was he. Brenda's throat tightened as she listened, understanding at last the depth of Charles's grief. His loss had left him trapped in a sadness that had pulled him away from the world. But somehow, Laurie's presence seemed to be rekindling a bit of the light that had once been lost. As Brenda listened, she suddenly realized she hadn't heard anything about Claudia's mother. Deborah's face tightened, as if this subject was even harder to discuss than the child's passing. She left soon after the accident, Deborah finally said. The guilt and pain were too much for her. It's not something we talk about much here, but Mr. Charles never forgave her for it. Losing his daughter was unbearable. And then he lost her too. Deborah looked meaningfully at Brenda, who sat quietly, absorbing this new piece of Charles's life. The depth of his losses ran far deeper than she'd imagined. It wasn't just the death of his daughter. It was the unraveling of his entire family, his entire life. Brenda felt a deep sense of empathy for him and growing unease about the impact she and Laurie might be having on his life. He seems better, she commented carefully. At least, since Laurie started visiting, I've noticed he's more open. Deborah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Your daughter has brought a bit of sunshine to this place, something I haven't seen in a long time. Miss Brenda, I truly believe you and Laurie are helping Mr. Charles in ways you don't even realize. Deborah paused, hesitating. But, she continued softly, there's someone who isn't pleased about this. Brenda frowned, concerned. Who do you mean? Deborah's voice dropped, as if worried someone might overhear. Miss Victoria, Mr. Charles's sister. She's been handling the family business since his daughter passed. She's always been ambitious and very controlling. Ever since you and Laurie began visiting, she seemed more tense. I don't know her exact thoughts, but I can tell you she's not comfortable with the changes she's seeing in him. Brenda didn't know what to make of it. She had met Victoria briefly before, a polite but rather aloof woman. Could it be that Victoria saw Brenda and Laurie as a threat to her influence over Charles? Before she could ask more, Laurie dashed into the kitchen, cheeks glowing with excitement. Mom, come see the game I made up in the garden, she cried, tugging her mum's hand eagerly. Brenda beamed and nodded, ready to follow her daughter. But as she stepped out of the kitchen, she glanced back one last time at Deborah, who met her gaze with a silent warning. The rest of the afternoon was calm. Charles seemed more at ease than usual, and as he watched Laurie playing in the yard, Brenda noticed a faint smile appearing on his face. It was like a little light breaking through the years of sadness that had weighed him down. Brenda wondered if maybe, just maybe, she and Laurie could truly help him heal. As the afternoon slipped away and the sun began to set, Deborah's words lingered in Brenda's mind, casting a shadow. Victoria, Charles's sister, had been watching them closely, and while she hadn't shown outright hostility, Brenda sensed that tension was building. When it came time to leave, Charles walked Brenda and Laurie to the door as always. Laurie, exhausted from her time outside, gave Charles a big grin as she said goodbye, and Brenda thanked him again for his hospitality. "We'll see you soon, won't we, Charles?" Laurie asked with her usual energy. Charles smiled and nodded, but before Brenda could respond, Victoria's voice rang out from the hallway. "Charles, we need to discuss those business matters. It's urgent," she said sharply, her impatience hard to miss. Charles nodded slightly, glancing at his sister with a look that mixed fatigue and resignation. "Sure, Victoria, I'll be right there," he replied, before turning back to Brenda and Laurie. "Take care." As Brenda and Laurie left the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. She knew Charles was starting to open up, but Victoria wouldn't let that happen without resistance. As they walked home, the weight of it all pressed down on Brenda. Her presence in Charles's life was making a difference, but it was also leading them into tricky territory, one where family loyalty, power, and control would be major forces. The shadow of Charles's past wasn't just in his heart, it was embodied by Victoria, and Brenda had an unsettling feeling that everything was about to reach a boiling point. The sudden ring of the doorbell pulled Brenda out of her thoughts as she cleaned the kitchen. It had been a long day, and though her visits to Charles's mansion had brought hope and light, her day-to-day responsibilities still felt heavy. At first, she thought it might be Laurie, forgetting something after their park trip. But when she opened the door, her heart stopped in its tracks. With an unfamiliar grin, Fred stood before Brenda, a man she barely recognized now, despite the years they once shared. Years ago, he disappeared, leaving her and Laurie to manage on their own. Now, out of the blue, he has reappeared, looking polished with new clothes, a new haircut, and an unsettling sparkle in his eyes that Brenda senses isn't the result of regret. Fred had always been charming on the surface, but she knew too well the selfishness hidden beneath. "Brenda," he murmured, his tone deceptively soft, loaded with empty promises. "It's been a while. Can we talk?" The sight of him made Brenda's whole body tense. She hadn't expected this encounter, nor the swirl of conflicting feelings it stirred. Her first impulse was to slam the door on him, but the thought of Laurie held her back. She couldn't simply shut him out, not when her daughter had often asked about him, hoping he might come back someday. Brenda knew she couldn't let Fred slip back into their lives without a confrontation. "Why are you here, Fred?" she asked, her voice tight. Fred's expression was annoyingly casual, as if he'd never abandoned them, as if those years were just a small oversight. "I came to see you and Laurie," he replied, the words hollow. "I've changed, Brenda. I'm here to make things right. I want my family back." The nerve of it stirred a fire in her. Get his family back. After all those years of silence and absence, now he was here, full of empty promises. She knew she had to keep her emotions in check, but Fred's old wounds were still raw. "Get your family back," she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "You can't just vanish for years and expect to walk back into our lives like nothing happened, Fred." He held up his hands as if in surrender. I know, I messed up, really messed up, but I'm here now. I want to make it right." Brenda scanned his face, searching for a hint of truth. But she knew Fred too well. There was an ulterior motive here, something that had nothing to do with being a father. And then, as if fate were rubbing salt in the wound, she recalled her recent visits to Charles's mansion. Had Fred somehow found out? "Why now?" she pressed, crossing her arms. Fred's smile turned icy, sending a chill through her. "I've been hearing things, Brenda. Word is, you've been cozying up with some wealthy guy. Looks like things have been going well for you." I thought maybe we could start fresh, give Laurie the life we always wanted her to have, something better. There it was, the real reason behind his sudden show of regret. Fred hadn't returned out of love or a change of heart. He was back because he assumed Brenda had finally broken free from their old struggles, and he saw an opportunity to benefit from it. Brenda felt a wave of disgust and anger rise within her at Fred's brazen selfishness. For a moment, she imagined how life might have looked if he'd never left them. But that life was gone. Those dreams shattered long ago, forcing her to build everything up again by herself. So, that's it, huh? Brenda muttered, her jaw clenched. You didn't come for Laurie, or for me. You're here because you think there's something to gain. Fred, realizing his motives had been exposed, quickly tried to change his approach. Brenda, don't take it like that. I want to be part of Laurie's life. She deserves to have her father, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make that happen. No. Brenda's voice rose, cutting him off. You can't just walk back in and expect us to welcome you. Laurie isn't some convenience for you to use whenever it suits you. She deserves more than that. Someone who actually cares. Fred paused, his expression calculating, then offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, maybe Laurie will want to hear my side. Who knows? Maybe she'll give me a chance. Brenda's heart dropped. She knew how much Laurie had longed for her father's return, and now Fred would try to take advantage of that hope. The thought of him manipulating her daughter twisted Brenda's insides. She couldn't let him hurt them again, but Laurie also had the right to know her father. She felt cornered, torn between anger and helplessness. If you ever hurt her. Brenda's voice was thick with emotion, shaking. Fred cut in, his tone chillingly calm. I won't. I only want what's best for her, and for you. Brenda looked at him, searching for any hint of sincerity, but all she saw was the same calculating man who had once shattered her world. Finally, she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to keep her emotions in check. Stay out of our lives, Fred, unless I say otherwise. If Laurie chooses to see you, it'll be her decision. Don't push her. Fred flashed a small smile, as if he had scored a tiny victory. I'll do things the right way, Brenda. I promise. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the doorway. Brenda stayed there, watching him disappear into the distance, feeling the weight of past mistakes pressing down on her shoulders. Fred's sudden return was bound to stir up trouble, and she braced herself for what lay ahead. Later that evening, while Brenda was preparing dinner, Laurie burst into the kitchen, full of her usual energy. Mom, who was that man earlier? She asked curiously. Brenda's stomach tightened. She didn't want to hide the truth from Laurie, but she also didn't want her daughter to get false hope, thinking her father had finally changed. That was your dad, Laurie, Brenda replied carefully, preparing herself for Laurie's reaction. Laurie's eyes went wide with surprise and excitement. Dad, he's really back. Brenda nodded, but quickly added, Yes, but I need you to understand something, honey. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I'm not sure what his intentions are. I just want you to be prepared. Your dad left a long time ago, and he hasn't been here for us since. So, we have to be careful. Laurie's excitement tempered slightly, and she nodded thoughtfully, absorbing her mother's words. Will we see him again? She asked. Brenda sighed. If you'd like to, you can see him. But remember, your dad hasn't always been there, and I don't want him to let you down. Laurie thought for a moment, excitement still lingering in her eyes, but Brenda noticed a hint of understanding there too. That night, as Laurie slept, Brenda lay awake, staring into the darkness, wondering what Fred's return would mean for them. She knew he hadn't changed, and that his presence would likely bring more complications. As she looked up at the ceiling, memories from the past loomed, threatening to undo everything she'd worked so hard to build. In the following weeks, the atmosphere at Charles's mansion shifted. Once filled with heavy memories, the mansion now held hints of warmth. Laurie's laughter rang through the garden, and Charles, though still guarded, seemed to soften, showing small but noticeable changes. Brenda saw it too, yet couldn't ignore the sense of unease that lingered around them. Fred's reappearance was certain to disrupt their fragile peace, and Victoria, Charles's sister, was acting oddly, making Brenda anxious. One afternoon, after a long day of laughter in the garden, Charles approached Brenda as Laurie ran playfully among the flowers. There was a certain look in his eyes, a hint that he had something significant on his mind, but he seemed unsure of how to begin. "Brenda, do you have a minute?" Charles asked, his tone more serious than she was used to. She nodded, settling onto one of the benches in the garden, with Charles joining her at her side. The tension between them was almost tangible, making Brenda uneasy. "Of course, Charles. Is everything okay?" Charles exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the distant skyline before he spoke. "I've noticed that things have felt different since Fred came back into your life. I may not know a lot about him, but I'm concerned about what this could mean for you and Laurie." Brenda gave him a grateful look, appreciating his worry, but also feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Fred," she began, choosing her words cautiously. "He's brought a lot of pain into our lives. I don't know why he's back, but I know it's not for the right reasons. He's after something, and it doesn't have anything to do with us." Charles nodded, sensing her apprehension, which only deepened his own concerns about Fred's potential impact on their lives. "If there's anything I can do to help," Charles started, but Brenda cut him off. "I don't want you to get involved, Charles. This is my issue to deal with. I don't want you caught up in my problems," she said, though deep down she knew Fred would likely stop at nothing to get what he was after. Charles looked at her, a mix of determination and warmth in his eyes. "Brenda, you and Laurie are already a part of my life. I can't just ignore this." Brenda looked back at him, filled with gratitude, but also a deep uncertainty, realizing just how complex her situation with Fred had become. Meanwhile, across town, Fred was scheming, figuring out the best way to use the situation to his advantage. He knew that the key to getting what he wanted was to drive a wedge between Brenda and Charles, and the opportunity came in an unlikely form. Victoria, Charles's sister. Victoria had been keeping a close eye on the relationship between Charles, Brenda, and Laurie, and she wasn't pleased with what she saw. While her brother had withdrew, engulfed in grief, Victoria had spent years keeping the family business under control. But now, the arrival of Brenda and Laurie threatened to upend everything she had carefully constructed. Victoria feared not only losing control over the family's assets, but also worried that Charles, clouded by emotions, might make choices that would put the family's wealth at risk. Knowing that Fred was the weak link, Victoria planned to approach him for a partnership. She was aware he had his own hidden agendas, and she believed they could manipulate the situation to their mutual benefit. One afternoon, as Fred strolled through town, mulling over his approach to Charles, he received a call from Victoria. "We need to talk," she said, her tone frosty. Intrigued, Fred agreed, and a few hours later they met at a quiet restaurant on the city's outskirts. Victoria, as usual, was flawlessly dressed, her expression sharp and calculating, putting Fred on edge. "I don't know why you wanted to meet, but I'm listening," Fred said as she took a sip of coffee. "I know why you've resurfaced in Brenda's life," Victoria responded bluntly, "and I know what you're after." Fred raised an eyebrow, grinning slightly. "And what do you think that is?" Victoria fixed her gaze on him, unwavering. "Money," security, a chance to get something out of this. You're not the first opportunist I've met, but we have something in common, Fred. Neither of us wants Brenda getting any closer to my brother. Fred fell silent for a moment, taken aback by her directness. He knew she was ambitious, but he hadn't expected her to be so straightforward. Go on, he replied, intrigued. Victoria leaned in, her elbows on the table, speaking with intent. My brother is vulnerable, and Brenda's gaining his trust. If this continues, she'll have more control than you might realize, and we can't let that happen. I need someone who can drive them apart, and that's where you come in. I want you to use your influence over Brenda and Laurie to create tension. Make my brother doubt her motives, make him think she's just after his money. Fred smiled, now fully grasping her scheme. And what's in it for me? Victoria's smile was as cold as her words. Money, a substantial amount. If you succeed in separating them, you'll get a significant payoff. But that wasn't all. If you approached this the right way, the rewards could go even further. Picture what could happen if we got Charles to see you as a trustworthy ally in all of this. Fred mulled over the idea. He knew he wasn't exactly a saint, but he also understood that with a bit of finesse, he could turn this situation to his advantage. I'm in, he finally said. Deal, Victoria replied with a satisfied grin, pleased to have secured her partner in this scheme. She was aware of the fragile state of things between Charles and Brenda, and Fred was the perfect instrument to disrupt that relationship before it had a chance to deepen. Over the next few days, Fred started inching closer to Laurie, doing everything he could to gain her trust. He brought her small gifts, spoke fondly of old times, and tried to present himself as a father full of regret, eager to make amends. Although Laurie felt happy to have her father back, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something about the way he spoke about Charles didn't sit right with her. Mum, why doesn't Dad want us spending time with Charles? Laurie asked one afternoon, after Fred made a few cutting remarks about Charles's wealth. Brenda, who had been steering clear of the subject, realized it was finally time to talk openly with her daughter. Laurie, your dad has his own thoughts on what's best for us, but you and I both know that Charles has been good to us. Don't let anyone make you question that, Brenda replied, a sense of worry weighing on her words. She was aware that Fred was beginning to impact Laurie's life, and she dreaded that he might push Laurie away from Charles, who had gradually become someone significant for both her and her daughter. Little did Brenda know, behind the scenes, Victoria and Fred were weaving a plot that could threaten everything she had worked to create. The vibe at Charles's mansion had shifted, but now it was more than just the haunting memories that had once filled its rooms. It was something subtler, something that sent a chill down Brenda's spine. She sensed it every time she stepped through the iron gate, every time her eyes met Charles's. His demeanor had changed since Fred had resurfaced. The warmth she used to feel in her talks with Charles seemed to be slipping away bit by bit, replaced by a cool distance she couldn't ignore. That afternoon, as she and Laurie arrived for their usual visit to the mansion, Charles welcomed them with the same courteous smile, but Brenda noticed his expression lacked the warmth she had once cherished. As Laurie ran off to play in the garden, unaware of the tension, Brenda lingered with Charles in the foyer. Are you all right? Brenda asked, scanning his face with concern. Charles gave a small nod, his reply distant, almost detached. Yeah, I just have a lot going on. She didn't push him further, but unease began creeping into her mind. Fred's words echoed inside her head. She knew her ex-husband could be cunning, adept at planting doubts and playing on emotions. Yet, she hadn't expected his influence to weigh on Charles so quickly. As they walked toward the living room, an awkward silence hung between them, heavy and unsettling. After all the weeks of connection and closeness they'd shared, this sudden distance felt unnatural, as if something unseen had wedged itself between them, holding back the relationship's progress. In the living room, Charles sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly, an anxious look in his eyes. He was clearly struggling with something significant. "Brenda," he started quietly, avoiding her gaze, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you don't take it the wrong way." Brenda's heart pounded as she braced herself, sensing the weight of what he was about to say. "Of course," she replied, voice steady, though anxiety simmered beneath. He took a long breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about how our lives have merged so fast, and I can't shake the feeling that maybe all of this isn't by chance." He finally looked up, his eyes full of uncertainty. "Or if maybe you're seeing something in me, a kind of opportunity." His words hit her like a splash of ice water. Did he really believe she was using him? After everything they'd shared, the trust, the vulnerable moments, was this the doubt in his mind? "An opportunity," Brenda repeated, her disbelief evident. "What are you saying, Charles?" He squirmed in his seat, visibly uncomfortable yet resolve. "I don't want to come across as harsh, Brenda, but I've been hearing things. People around me, even Fred, have been saying things. They think maybe you're not just here for friendship or to support me, but that there's a financial angle to it." Brenda stood there for a moment, struck silent, as a wave of frustration and hurt welled up inside her. After everything she'd done for him, all the moments they'd shared, it was beyond belief that Charles could think that way. "Fred?" Brenda asked, in shock. "You're actually listening to Fred, the man who left me behind and couldn't be bothered about his own daughter for years?" Charles looked away, his expression hardening, but Brenda couldn't hold back her hurt. "I can't believe you'd let his words get to you, and that you'd actually doubt me because of him. You know what I've been through, everything I've done to make sure Laurie's cared for. I've never once asked for your money, Charles. All I've ever wanted is for you to heal, to finally find some peace after all the pain." Her words were raw, full of feeling, yet Charles's face showed traces of doubt. The fear and betrayal he had experienced since losing his daughter had fueled the mistrust that Victoria and Fred had sown. "I understand, Brenda," he replied, "but try to see it from where I'm standing. I've had people take advantage of me before, people who seemed genuine, but weren't. My own circle has shown me how appearances can be deceiving." Brenda felt a deep pang in her chest. She knew Charles had been hurt, but she couldn't accept that he was putting her in the same league as those who'd betrayed him. She'd thought they were building something real, something based on honesty and mutual care. But now that belief felt like it was slipping through her fingers. "I'm not like those people, Charles," she said, her voice shaking. "Everything I've done, for you and for Laurie, has been from the heart. I've only ever wanted to see you whole again." Charles's face softened, a hint of regret breaking through his guarded expression. He could feel he was being unfair, but his insecurities weighed him down. "I'm sorry, Brenda," he murmured. "I just had to ask. I can't handle more heartbreak." Brenda nodded slowly, swallowing back the tears welling in her eyes. She understood he was wounded, still piecing himself back together. But she also realized that she couldn't stay in a relationship where her sincerity would forever be questioned. "If you can't believe in me, Charles, I'm not sure how we can keep going with this," she said finally, standing up from her chair. Charles looked at her, taken aback, as if he hadn't expected that kind of answer. Brenda had always been the one with boundless patience, the one who understood. But now, Charles could see that his own insecurities were driving away the very person who had begun to restore some light to his life. "Brenda, I don't want things to end this way," he said, rising to his feet as well. But Brenda had already made up her mind. "Neither do I. But if you can't trust me, I don't know what else I can do," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Charles alone to wrestle with his guilt, his doubts, and his remorse. Outside, Laurie was joyfully playing in the yard, completely unaware of the tension unfolding indoors. Brenda, fighting back tears, approached her daughter gently, saying, "Sweetheart, it's time to go." Laurie, surprised they were leaving so early, didn't ask any questions. She just took her mother's hand, and together they left the mansion, leaving Charles to ponder his choices. As they walked home, an uncomfortable silence hung between Brenda and Laurie. Always sensitive to her mother's moods, Laurie sensed that something was wrong. "Mum, why did we leave so soon?" she asked eventually. Brenda looked at her, forcing a smile, though she knew she couldn't hide the truth forever. "Sometimes, honey, people don't realize all we do for them, and when that happens, we have to let them have some time to understand," she explained. Though still confused, Laurie nodded, trusting her mother's words. Brenda knew deep down that this conflict wasn't over. She was certain that someone had planted these doubts in Charles's mind, and in her heart, she knew Fred and Victoria were the ones responsible. Her instincts told her that things were about to get even more complicated, and she would need to stand up for herself, for Laurie, and for what was right. The sky had taken on a stormy grey, signaling the arrival of rain and a change in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Brenda had sensed it from the moment she'd woken that morning. Charles's words replayed in her mind, and despite her efforts to push them away, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping through her fingers. Even though their last conversation had left a chill, a small part of her still clung to hope. But that hope dimmed as Fred appeared. It was early when he burst through her door, his face contorted with a mix of anger and smugness, a sign that things were about to escalate in ways she couldn't ignore. Brenda's hand slipped, and the plate she'd been rinsing shattered as it hit the floor. The sharp clatter jolted her, mirroring the dread creeping up her spine. "What are you doing here, Fred?" she asked, struggling to steady her voice, her pulse racing. Fred stepped inside, uninvited, shutting the door firmly behind him. His smile was cold, his gaze piercing with a focus Brenda recognized all too well. She'd seen him like this before, but something about his presence today felt more ominous. "What am I doing here?" he echoed mockingly. "I'm here to end this little game you're playing, Brenda. Enough with pretending you're living some perfect life with that rich guy." Anger stirred within Brenda as she fought to keep her composure. Fred had no right to show up like this, not after abandoning them. But she knew he wouldn't leave easily. He was always a master manipulator, pressing just the right buttons to get his way. "I'm not pretending, Fred," she shot back, barely keeping her fury in check. "I'm doing what you never did. I'm taking care of our daughter." For a brief moment, Fred's face darkened, revealing a flicker of resentment. "Taking care of her," he sneered. "Or using that man? Because from where I stand, it looks like you found yourself an easy ticket, and you're using Laurie to make sure he keeps handing over whatever you want." His words struck Brenda like a blow. She knew this was the image Fred wanted to create, one he'd likely try to use against her with Charles too. She had always suspected Fred had come back because he saw an opportunity in her new life. But now she realized just how low he would go. "You don't understand anything," Brenda replied, fighting back tears. "Charles has been there for us, but I've never taken advantage of him. I'm not like you, Fred. I don't use people to get what I want. Ignoring her words, Fred advanced toward her with measured steps, his expression chilling. Instinctively, Brenda took a step back, though she tried to stand firm. "I'm going to see him, Brenda," Fred said quietly, his voice edged with menace. "I'm going to tell him everything, and when he hears my side, this perfect little life of yours will be finished." Brenda's heart pounded, a turbulent mix of fear and anger churning inside her. She knew Fred was set on tearing down everything she'd tirelessly built, and she also knew if he unleashed his accusations at Charles, it would risk whatever fragile connection she had left with him. "You can't do this, Fred. You have no right," Brenda said, her voice edged with desperation. Fred simply replied with a chilling smirk, "Just watch me." Before Brenda could stop him, Fred bolted out of the house, resolute in his mission to confront Charles at his estate. She hurried after him, her mind racing to find a way to prevent the impending disaster. She couldn't let him ruin everything, certainly not like this. As they reached Charles's mansion, the building seemed even more imposing under the stormy sky. Raindrops started to fall, adding a dramatic edge to the scene. Without hesitation, Fred strode to the door, while Brenda, in a panic, tried to catch up before the situation spiraled out of hand. "Stop, Fred!" she called, but he ignored her. The doorbell's chime reverberated through the entrance, and soon Deborah, the housekeeper, answered, eyeing them with surprise. Before she could react, Fred pushed past her, forcing Deborah to step aside. "Where's Charles?" Fred demanded, his voice echoing across the foyer. Deborah, looking startled, glanced at Brenda, who could only shake her head in silent apology. Things were already slipping beyond her control. Moments later, Charles appeared at the top of the stairs, a look of confusion and concern crossing his face as he took in Fred's sudden intrusion. "What's going on here?" Charles's voice was steady, but his eyes darted between them. Fred turned to face him, his gaze fierce and unrelenting. "I'll tell you what's going on," Fred snarled. "You're being played, Charles. Brenda's been using you." Brenda felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her. The very words she'd dreaded hearing had finally been uttered, and their impact cut deeply. She looked to Charles, hoping he'd see through Fred's accusations, but his expression was clouded with doubt, the same doubt that had surfaced in their last conversation. "Fred, stop it!" Brenda shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Charles, slowly descending the stairs with his gaze locked on her, stayed silent. Fred took advantage of the moment to press on. "She's been manipulating you all along, Charles. I saw it from day one. All she cares about is your money." Fred's voice echoed through the spacious room, each word sharp and cutting. Brenda stood frozen, struggling to process what was unfolding before her. It was like sand slipping through her fingers. Everything she'd built with Charles was slipping away, and the dread was suffocating. She knew Fred was lying, but how could she convince Charles if he was already filled with doubt? "Charles, it's not true. You know it's not true," Brenda said, her voice quivering as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "I'm not here for your money. I never was." Charles paused just a few steps away from her, torn between his own heart and the venomous accusations Fred was spewing. The uncertainty in his gaze shattered her, each flicker of doubt like a crack in their foundation. "I want to believe you, Brenda," he whispered, "but I can't ignore everything happening around us. It's all been so fast, so out of nowhere, and now Fred's saying these things." Brenda couldn't take it anymore. She knew that if she didn't act, everything she cared about could vanish. Taking a steadying breath, Brenda stepped closer, reaching out to gently hold his hand. She met his eyes with unwavering resolve. "Listen to what your heart is telling you, Charles, not him. I'm not like Fred. I'd never hurt you. All I've ever wanted was to be by your side, to be someone you could lean on." Her voice softened as she continued, "Laurie cares about you deeply, and I do too." She knew this was her moment to be completely open, and her words lingered in the air, raw and genuine. Before Charles could respond, Fred, infuriated at being dismissed, stormed forward. "Don't believe her, Charles. She's lying," he bellowed, his face flushed with anger. But before Fred could go on, Charles raised his hand, silencing him. "That's enough, Fred," he said firmly. "I won't let you stir up any more trouble here." Startled by Charles's sudden resolve, Fred took a step back, his eyes filled with resentment. "You'll regret this, Charles. Mark my words. You're making a huge mistake," Fred sneered, before storming out of the mansion, leaving a heavy tension in the air. Brenda, still shaken by the confrontation, searched Charles's face for any sign of trust, clinging to the hope that he still believed in her. Charles stood there, silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, as though he was taking in every bit of what had just unfolded. When he finally raised his eyes to meet Brenda's, the words that came out weren't the ones she had anticipated. "I need time, Brenda," he murmured softly, his voice low and somber. "I need to think." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading, as he left her standing alone in the vast, empty foyer. The closing of the door echoed throughout the mansion, leaving Brenda feeling as though the foundation of everything she had worked to build was beginning to crumble. The days that followed the confrontation weighed heavily on Brenda. A storm that had loomed for days finally broke, releasing a steady, relentless rain that seemed to mirror her inner turmoil. Every raindrop tapping on the small roof of her house reminded her that her life, which had slowly started to mend, now felt shattered once again. Laurie, always sensitive to her mother's emotions, noticed something was amiss, even though Brenda tried to maintain a calm front to shield her. But even Laurie's boundless energy and bright smile began to fade, replaced by quiet questions. Why weren't they going back to the mansion? Why hadn't Charles come to visit? And why did her mother seem so distant and sad? Brenda knew that sooner or later she'd have to face the reality of the situation and explain it to Laurie. But she wasn't sure how. How could she find the words to explain that Charles's doubts and Fred's lies had unraveled the hope they had found? How could she tell her daughter they might never return to the mansion that Laurie had grown to love? One grey afternoon, as rain continued to stream down, Laurie approached Brenda, who was sitting at the small kitchen table, lost in thought. "Mum, why haven't we seen Charles lately?" Laurie asked, her voice soft yet laced with confusion. Brenda felt her stomach tighten, realizing this conversation was unavoidable, though it didn't make it any easier. "Sweetheart," Brenda began, her words hesitant, "things with Charles, they've gotten complicated." Laurie looked at her mother, waiting for a clearer answer. "Complicated? Why? Doesn't Charles want to see us anymore?" she asked, her brow furrowed in worry. Brenda swallowed, trying to find the right words. She didn't want Laurie to lose hope, but she also knew she had to be truthful with her. "Charles is dealing with a lot, Laurie. He's had some doubts," she said softly. "Things Fred told him, things that aren't true, but they've caused him to question me, to question us." Laurie's eyes widened as she heard her father's name. "Dad? What did Dad say to him?" Brenda took a deep breath, knowing it was time for full honesty. "Fred made Charles believe we're with him just for his money, that we're using him. But that's not true, and you know that, honey." Brenda's tone was gentle but firm. "We're with Charles because he's a good man, because we care about him, and he cares about you too." Laurie fell silent, letting her mother's words sink in. Brenda could see the pain and confusion in her daughter's expression, but there was something else, a faint glimmer of understanding beginning to take root. "Then why don't we just tell Charles the truth?" Laurie asked with a determined tone. Brenda managed a small smile at her daughter's straightforward solution. If only things were that easy. But she knew it was more complicated than that. The doubt Fred had planted in Charles wouldn't disappear overnight. "Sometimes the truth isn't enough, Laurie," Brenda said, sadness in her voice. "Sometimes, when people are hurt or scared, it's hard for them to accept the truth, even when it's right in front of them." Laurie studied her mother intently, as though trying to make sense of a world that felt unjust and bewildering. Finally she nodded, though her face still showed traces of doubt. "Will we see Charles again?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Brenda's heart ached even more at the question. She wanted to tell her everything would be okay and that things would return to normal. But the truth was, she didn't know. She didn't know if Charles could ever fully trust her again, or if they could repair what had been broken. "I don't know, sweetheart. I just don't know," Brenda replied, unable to stop the tears welling up in her eyes. As Laurie moved closer, she wrapped her arms tightly around her mother. Brenda, embracing the warmth and innocence of her daughter, held on, allowing her tears to flow freely. In that moment, as the rain continued to tap against the windows, Brenda realized something. No matter what Fred and Charles had done, she had something that could never be taken away. She had Laurie and her sense of self-worth. As the days went by, Brenda started to find some of her strength again. She reminded herself that she couldn't let pain and uncertainty take control. Fred had come back and caused chaos, and while he'd succeeded in disrupting things, Brenda wasn't about to let her whole life crumble. She'd faced worse and knew she could get through this too. One afternoon, while she was at home, her phone rang unexpectedly. It was Deborah, the long-standing housekeeper from Charles's estate. "Brenda, I'm sorry to call you this way, but I thought you should know," Deborah said, her voice laced with worry. "Victoria has been talking to Charles quite a bit lately. I think she's trying to convince him that Fred's lies are true." A sinking feeling hit Brenda as she listened. She'd always known Victoria opposed her relationship with Charles, but she hadn't imagined how far she'd go to tear them apart. "What should I do, Deborah?" Brenda asked, as a wave of helplessness washed over her. "I don't know, Brenda. But if you don't take action soon, Victoria may succeed in turning Charles away from you forever," Deborah answered, clearly concerned. Brenda ended the call feeling even more defeated. She knew she had to act, but she was at a loss for how. Showing up unannounced at the estate didn't seem like an option. Charles had already told her he needed space, yet something in her heart told her she couldn't give up. Not now. Finally, after days of inner turmoil, Brenda reached a decision. She realized she couldn't make Charles believe her, but she also couldn't let Victoria and Fred continue spinning lies. She decided to confront Charles, to talk to him one last time, and to share her truth. If he chose to turn away after that, she'd have to accept it. That afternoon, she made her way to the estate with Laurie by her side. When they arrived, the door opened, and there stood Deborah. Relief and worry mingling in her expression. "Charles is in the study," Deborah whispered, "but be careful, Brenda. Victoria is here too." Brenda gave a grateful nod, thankful for the heads up. She knew Victoria wouldn't sit back quietly, but Brenda was ready to face her if she had to. She couldn't let the lies take over. Holding Laurie's hand, she moved toward the study, feeling the weight of the truth she was about to reveal. As she approached the door, Brenda took a steady breath before tapping lightly. Charles's muffled response allowed her to step inside. She found him behind his desk, his face drawn with tension and worry. Victoria stood nearby, arms crossed, glaring at Brenda with obvious contempt. In that instant, Brenda knew that this encounter would shape her future. "Charles, we need to talk," she began, her voice calm yet firm. Charles looked up, caught off guard by her presence, though he remained silent. Victoria, however, offered a mocking smirk, as if victory was already hers. "Well, Brenda," Victoria sneered, "what could you possibly have to say now? Another excuse to explain why you're here?" Brenda ignored her, locking eyes with Charles. "I didn't come to explain anything away. I'm here to tell you the truth," Brenda said, her voice trembling slightly but unwavering. "After that, you can make up your own mind." Charles's gaze was filled with doubt, yet Brenda sensed a flicker of willingness to listen, a small glimmer of hope. The silence in Charles's study was nearly tangible, thick with tension. Brenda stood near the door, feeling the weight of every gaze on her. Victoria's cold smile suggested she believed herself the victor. Charles, caught between two conflicting worlds, wrestled with his doubts and lingering feelings. Nearby, young Laurie watched the scene unfold, her face full of confusion. She could feel the strain in the room, without fully understanding it. All she wished was for life to return to how it had been when Charles was there, making the mansion feel like home. Brenda's heart raced, but she knew she couldn't delay any longer. She'd come to face the truth and defend it, determined not to let Victoria and Fred tear down what she had worked so hard to build. "Charles, I know you have doubts," Brenda said with steady emotion. "I know things have grown complicated since Fred came back, and Victoria has only fueled those doubts. But I need you to see that what we've shared is real. I never wanted anything from you but your friendship and trust," Victoria scoffed, breaking the moment with a sarcastic laugh. "Friendship?" she mocked. "Come on, Charles. Are you really that blind? This woman has been manipulating you all along. She and her daughter walked in when you were vulnerable and took full advantage." Brenda regarded Victoria steadily, refusing to let the sting of her harsh words unsettle her. "I never manipulated Charles, and you know it," Brenda said, her voice unwavering as she met Victoria's gaze. "If anyone's been doing the manipulating here, it's you. Since day one, you've been intent on keeping Charles away from anyone who could offer him hope. All because you're terrified of losing your grip on him. This isn't about protecting him. It's always been about you needing to control his life." Victoria's expression tightened, but she held her ground unfazed. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Victoria replied icily. "Everything I've done has been for my brother's sake, to protect him from people like you." Brenda sensed the tension intensifying, but she stood firm. She knew that if Charles didn't hear the truth now, he'd be lost to her forever. "Charles," Brenda continued gently, "I know you're in pain and that you've endured so much. But please listen. Since your daughter's passing, Victoria has dictated every aspect of your life, isolating you in your grief. She doesn't want you to heal, because that would mean you'd take back control of your life. And that's her greatest fear." Charles, who had been silent up until then, finally lifted his gaze, and Brenda could see the turmoil in his eyes. "Brenda," he murmured, his voice barely audible, full of doubt. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Everything feels so tangled. Fred showed up saying things that made me question everything. Victoria's been here for me through it all. How am I supposed to know who to trust?" Brenda stepped closer, her eyes fixed on his. "Trust yourself, Charles. Trust in what we've shared. Fred isn't here for Laurie or me. He's here because he saw an opportunity. And Victoria, she cares for you, I know. But she's kept you chained to your sorrow because she can't confront her own guilt, Brenda said, her voice steady and honest. Victoria, visibly shaken, stepped forward, her face showing a flicker of vulnerability. Guilt? What are you implying? She demanded, her voice thick with restrained anger. Brenda held her gaze, sensing for the first time that she had truly struck a nerve. For years, you've carried the weight of Claudia's death, letting it consume you with guilt. You think that keeping Charles trapped in his pain will somehow protect him, but all it's really doing is tearing him apart. Victoria, you can't undo the past, and isolating your brother from those who care about him won't save him. Victoria's face went pale, and for a moment her composed, icy exterior cracked. Her eyes burned with a mix of anger and hurt. You don't know what you're talking about, she muttered, her voice trembling. Brenda sensed that the turning point had arrived. She knew Victoria was still carrying the weight of Claudia's death, and that it fueled her need to control Charles. But if Victoria couldn't confront the truth, none of them would ever find peace. I'm not here to judge you, Victoria, Brenda said, her tone gentle yet resolute. I know you've suffered too, but this can't go on. Charles deserves a life beyond this pain, and so do you. Charles, who had been sitting silently, finally stood, looking at his sister. Is it true, Victoria? He asked, his voice low but filled with emotion. Have you been trying to control everything because of your guilt? Victoria looked back at him, and for a moment it seemed like she might deny it. But then, as if a floodgate opened, her eyes filled with tears. You don't understand, Charles, she whispered, her voice cracking. I always felt that if I'd just done something differently, if I'd paid more attention, Claudia might still be here. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you too. Charles moved toward her, not with anger, but with a deep sense of empathy and sorrow. Victoria, I've struggled with Claudia's death too, but you can't keep me imprisoned in this pain. You can't control everything to prevent something bad from happening. It's time to let the past go. Victoria broke down, and Brenda stood quietly as Charles pulled his sister into a hug. It was a moment filled with sorrow and release, both siblings shedding their silent burdens of guilt and pain, finding a small measure of freedom. After a long moment, Victoria pulled back, tears still streaming down her face. You're right, Charles, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I never intended to hurt you. My only goal was to keep you safe. Charles gave a slight nod, staying silent. He knew no words could undo what had happened, yet he recognized that the path to healing began with acceptance. Sensing the shift between the siblings, Brenda stepped toward the door, hoping to give them a private moment. Just as she was about to leave, Charles's voice stopped her. Brenda, hold on. She paused, turning to face him, her heart racing. Thank you, Charles said, his eyes a mix of gratitude and remorse. I'm sorry I doubted you, he added, his voice softer. Brenda gave a gentle smile, sensing a glimmer of hope. All I want is for you to find the peace you deserve, Charles. We all deserve that, she replied genuinely. Charles nodded, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Brenda noticed a hopeful spark in his eyes. Though the road ahead would be long, she sensed that this was the start of a new chapter, one that could finally begin to mend old wounds. In the days following their conversation at Charles's estate, the once tense atmosphere began to clear. The storm seemed to have passed, leaving behind space for growth and healing. With each passing day, Brenda felt a burden lifting. Charles's relationship with his sister Victoria was still fragile, but their heartfelt exchange had marked a turning point. Aware of her past mistakes, Victoria chose to loosen her grip on Charles's life, realizing that her own path to healing required letting go. As for Charles, he had taken his first steps toward reconciling with himself. The talks with Brenda and the confrontation with Victoria had stirred something deep within him. After years spent in a cage of hurt and solitude, he now glimpsed the possibility of a new life, a life filled with promise and perhaps even love. A few weeks later, Brenda and her daughter Laurie returned to the estate. This time, everything felt different. There were no longer any doubts or tensions, just a warm sense of renewal. They found Charles in the garden, where the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the flowers, creating a scene of peace and beauty. "Look, Mom, the garden's more beautiful than ever," Laurie exclaimed, running joyfully toward the flowers, her laughter filling the air. Brenda watched her daughter with a soft smile, feeling that after all the turmoil and heartbreak, they were finally finding a place they could call home. As she approached, Charles greeted her with a warm smile and took her hand gently. For the first time in a long while, there was no hesitation in his eyes, only a quiet gratitude and a peace he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you for coming back," Charles murmured, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Brenda nodded, returning his smile, feeling a connection that ran deeper than ever. "There was no other choice for me," she replied earnestly. "I knew this was where we belonged." They found a seat on a garden bench, watching Laurie explore the area with her usual lively spirit. After a pause, Charles took a deep breath, as if mustering the courage for a difficult conversation. "Brenda, I've been thinking a lot lately, about everything that's happened, about you, about Laurie, about what I want for my life," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I've spent too long caught up in the past, letting the pain of losing Claudia and my own guilt keep me from moving forward. But you've shown me that there's another way, that I can find peace and happiness if I'm open to it." Brenda looked at him, sensing his words were coming straight from the heart. Their journey together had been tough, filled with challenges and missteps. Yet now Charles was beginning to see hope on the horizon. "I've always seen the strength in you, Charles," she said with a smile. "Even at your lowest, you knew there was more waiting for you. I'm so glad you're finally able to see that too." Charles's gaze softened, filled with affection and gratitude. "What I want now is to live a full life, not just for myself, but for those who matter most to me. You and Laurie, you've become a huge part of that life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want us to discover it together." Brenda felt her heart race as his words sank in. She hadn't expected life to lead her here, but standing with Charles now, she understood that everything they'd endured had a purpose. They had found something genuine in the midst of the chaos, something worth building and protecting. "I'd love that," Brenda replied, her smile widening. For a while they sat together in silence, savoring the peacefulness of the garden and each other's company. It was a quiet moment, yet one that carried the promise of new beginnings in their lives. Over the following days, the mansion gradually transformed into a home. Brenda and Laurie started visiting more frequently, not as outsiders, but as people who truly belonged. They were now part of the life Charles was building from the ground up. Victoria, though still a presence in Charles's life, had learned to give him space, allowing him to make his own choices. She stopped trying to steer his future, recognizing that her own path to healing would take patience. Fred, meanwhile, had vanished from their lives. Unable to sway Charles or Brenda to his will, he left just as he had come, with empty words and broken promises. Brenda knew he might return someday, but she was stronger now and determined to protect her life from his influence. Together, Charles, Brenda, and Laurie were creating an unconventional but close-knit family. Laurie, delighted to have Charles in her life, brought laughter and liveliness to the mansion. To her, Charles wasn't a replacement for her father, but a steady presence who brought a sense of calm and security. One sunny afternoon, as they all relaxed in the garden, Charles reached for Brenda's hand, smiling warmly at her. "This garden has never looked as beautiful as it does now," he said, glancing at Brenda and Laurie, "and I know it's because you both are here." Brenda returned his smile, feeling everything finally falling into place. "We feel the same way," she replied, gently squeezing his hand. "This place isn't just beautiful, it's where we started to heal." Charles nodded, and for the first time, the mansion, once a place of sorrow, felt like a genuine home, a place where old wounds could begin to mend and where the shadows of grief were replaced by the warmth of hope. As the sun set, Brenda, Charles and Laurie lingered in the garden, laughing and enjoying the moment. They had endured difficult times, but now together, they looked forward to a future filled with promise. And more than anything, it was a future they were ready to create side by side.